When you hear the name Mother Teresa, what's the first image that comes to mind? For most of us, it's pretty powerful, right? A small, stooped figure in that iconic blue and white sari, a global symbol of charity. But, like with a lot of icons, there's often another story hiding just out of sight, in the shadows, and that's what we're going to explore today.
She was called the Saint of the Gutters. I mean, that title perfectly captured her public image, her brand. This wasn't just some catchy nickname. It was the persona the entire world came to know and celebrate for decades. And her journey to official sainthood, well, it seems almost inevitable when you just look at the timeline. She starts the Missionaries of Charity way back in 1950, wins the Nobel Peace Prize in '79, and then eventually is canonized as a saint. Every single one of these milestones just cemented her legendary status. But what if that's not the whole story? What if there's a counter-narrative that challenges almost every single thing we think we know about her? It's a tough question for sure, but it's one we kind of have to ask to get the full picture. So in this explainer, we're going to be looking at claims from a pretty significant body of critical work, a lot of it from journalists and even former volunteers. We're calling this perspective the shadow of a saint. And let's be really clear, our goal isn't to tell you what to think. We're just going to lay out the arguments from these sources point by point. The source material really focuses its critique on three main areas. First, the actual quality of the medical care that was being given in her missions. Second, how the hundreds of millions of dollars in donations were managed. And third, the religious ideology that was supposedly driving the whole operation. Okay, let's start with the first and honestly maybe the most shocking area of criticism, the actual conditions inside her famous homes for the dying. The sources we're looking at make some deeply, deeply troubling claims about the care that was provided. They allege there was a systematic lack of hygiene, rudimentary care, and an absence of painkillers. I mean, that picture is a world away from the one most of us have in our heads. And this really gets to the heart of the conflict. The popular image is of these modern, compassionate hospices. But the source alleges these places were primarily homes for the dying, where people with conditions that were actually treatable were sometimes just neglected and left to perish. So let's break that down because the details are pretty specific. According to these sources, while a standard hospice would use strong pain medication, her missions were offering little more than aspirin for things like terminal cancer. They claim needles were often reused after just a quick rinse in cold water, and that getting a proper medical diagnosis was virtually impossible. This brings us right to the second major point of criticism, the money. The sources raise some really serious questions about the organization's finances. You see, the Missionaries of Charity became this global fundraising powerhouse. They received donations that are estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The money just poured in from people, governments, and foundations all over the world. And that leads to the big question that the critics pose. If the organization was getting this much money, why did all the first-hand accounts describe such primitive, awful conditions? Where did all that cash actually go? Well, the source material alleges a few things. A severe lack of financial transparency, which made it pretty much impossible to track the money. That the vast majority of funds were just kept in bank accounts, not actually spent on improving medical care. The priority, they claim, was opening more and more convents globally, not upgrading the facilities they already had. And finally, that donations were accepted from some very controversial figures. No questions asked. So this brings us to the third, and maybe the most complex part of the whole critique. The sources argue that the poor care and the financial decisions weren't just accidents or mismanagement. They were actually rooted in Mother Teresa's core beliefs. The source calls this her theology of suffering. The idea here is that suffering itself is a spiritually beautiful thing, a gift from God. By suffering, a poor or sick person was sharing in the passion of Christ. And that experience was seen as more important than actual medical relief. There's a quote often highlighted by critics, attributed to her in the source, that seems to capture this idea perfectly. There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot, to suffer it like Christ's passion. For critics, this single sentence really unlocks the entire ideology. So the crucial point, according to the source, is that the goal wasn't to end suffering with the best medicine available. Instead, it was to encourage people to endure their suffering for spiritual purposes. The critique is that she glorified pain rather than actually trying to alleviate it. So what do we do with all this? How are we supposed to reconcile the global icon that we know with these deeply disturbing claims from the source material? On one side, we have the public saint,
this amazing symbol of compassion and selfless love. And on the other, the sources paint a completely different picture. A figure whose public image they claim concealed poor medical care, questionable finances, and an ideology that basically celebrated pain. So the point of this explainer isn't to tear down a hero or tell you what to believe. It's to show that alongside the universally accepted story, a really serious and challenging counter-narrative exists, based on the sources we've examined.
Which leaves us with a final and pretty difficult question. You know, it's easy to celebrate heroes who are flawless, but history rarely gives us those. When a celebrated figure casts such a long, dark shadow, how does that change the way we see their light?